On a warm afternoon in May of 1998, an old man lay on a hillside in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He was 82 years old. His elbows rested on the grass, his cheek pressed against the worn stock of a rifle he had owned for more than half a century. Below him, 200 acres of rolling pasture stretched toward a line of hand-stacked stone walls. And beyond those walls, a cornfield just beginning to green in the late spring sun. 400 yards out near the edge of a fence post, a woodchuck sat upright in the grass, 6 inches of brown fur and black eyes chewing clover unaware. The old man watched the grass between himself and the animal. It bent gently from left to right, a light breeze maybe 4 miles per hour. He adjusted his aim 2 inches left, controlled his breathing, let half the air out of his lungs, held, and in the stillness between one heartbeat and the next he squeezed the trigger. The woodchuck dropped. The old man opened a small notebook from his shirt pocket. He wrote the date. The range 380 yards. The wind left to right light. The result kill. Then he closed the notebook and slid it back into his pocket next to his heart, where it had ridden every evening for 68 years. His name was Daniel Keller, and on his nightstand at home beside a glass of water and a bottle of aspirin, there were 2 notebooks that looked almost identical. The first notebook held more than 2,000 entries. Each one recorded the same information, date, range, wind result. Each one documented a woodchuck killed on this farm, on these hills, dating back to 1930. The handwriting changed over the decades, growing steadier through the 1930s. Confident through the 1940s and slowly more tremulous toward the final pages. But the format never changed. Not once in 68 years. The second notebook was thinner, much thinner. It held 89 entries, same format. Date, range, wind, result. Same handwriting, same calm clinical precision. No emotion, no commentary, just data. But this notebook did not record woodchucks. It recorded men. 89 men killed between September and December of 1944 in the rolling farmland of eastern France, all at ranges between 380 and 650 yards, all by Daniel Keller, all with the same rifle technique he had learned shooting woodchucks on a Pennsylvania dairy farm since the age of 14. If you placed the 2 notebooks side by side and covered the dates, you could not tell which one recorded animals and which one recorded human beings. The entries were identical, and perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about this story. Not the killing, not the distance, but the fact that for Daniel Keller, there was no difference in the craft. The only difference was what stood at the other end of the scope. On September 14th, 1944, in a valley that looked almost exactly like the south pasture of his father's farm, Daniel Keller stopped 80 German soldiers with a single rifle. 34 of them died that afternoon. All at ranges the United States Army said were impossible. All using skills he had practiced 10,000 times on targets smaller than a man's fist. The Army called those shots a miracle. Daniel called them woodchuck range. This is the full story. From the pastures of Pennsylvania to the valleys of Lorraine. From 25 cents a woodchuck to 89 notches on a rifle stock. And it begins not with a war, but with a father, a boy, and a sentence that would echo across 3 decades and 2 continents. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Today we are going to take you through the complete journey from the first missed shot on a Pennsylvania hillside to the longest kill in a French valley, and the 2 notebooks that tell the same story in 2 different worlds. To understand what Daniel Keller did on that September afternoon in France, you have to go back to 1930, to a dairy farm outside the town of Lancaster, in the heart of Pennsylvania Dutch country. 200 acres of rolling hills, hand-stacked stone walls, cornfields, and 60 Holstein dairy cows that needed milking twice a day, every in every season. The Keller family had worked this land for 3 generations. They were Pennsylvania Dutch descendants of German settlers who had come to Lancaster County in the 1820s, cleared the timber, pulled the rocks from the soil, stacked them into walls, and built a life defined by work silence and the turning of seasons. Harold Keller, Daniel's father, was the 3rd generation to milk cows on this hill. He was a man of few words and many calluses. His hands were thick and cracked from decades of gripping milking pails before dawn, mending fences in the rain, and wrestling feed bags off the back of a truck in winter. He worked 16 hours a day and complained about none of them. Harold had one problem he could not fix with his hands: woodchucks. They were everywhere on the farm, burrowing into the pastures, digging holes the size of a man's fist, sometimes bigger, right in the middle of the grazing fields where the cows walked. A cow steps in a woodchuck hole at the wrong angle and snaps a leg bone. A cow with a broken leg is a cow you have to put down, and a cow you put down in 1930s, an entire season of milk money gone. Harold could not afford to lose a single animal, so he paid his son Daniel 25 cents for every woodchuck the boy could kill. In 1930, 25 cents bought a loaf of bread. For a 14-year-old boy on a Depression-era farm, it was a fortune. But woodchucks were not easy targets. A woodchuck's head is about the width of a man's palm. That is your target. They feed at dawn and dusk, staying close to the mouths of their burrows. At the first sign of danger, the first unfamiliar sound or shadow, they vanish underground. You might not see that woodchuck again for 30 minutes. Sometimes not until the next day. You get one shot. Maybe. Miss it and the opportunity is gone. Harold gave Daniel a .22 caliber rifle and pointed him toward the south pasture. Daniel was 14. He had never fired a rifle in his life. The first evening he set up on the hillside overlooking the pasture, spotted a woodchuck near a stone wall about 150 yards out, aimed carefully and missed. The woodchuck disappeared. Daniel waited 40 minutes. It did not come back. The second evening, same result. Spotted a woodchuck at 100 yards. Fired. Missed. Gone. The third evening, Daniel missed 3 times in a row. 3 woodchucks, 3 shots, 3 clean misses. He was frustrated, angry at himself, angry at the rifle, angry at the tiny brown targets that vanished the instant he pulled the trigger. Harold had been watching from the fence line. He walked up the hill slowly, the way he did everything, and sat down next to his son in the grass. He did not speak for a long time. Harold Keller was not a man who rushed into words. He watched the pasture, watched the wind move through the grass, watched the light change on the stone walls as the sun dropped toward the ridge. Then he said the only thing Daniel would remember for the rest of his life: the shot is already made before you pull the trigger. Everything that matters happens before. Harold explained, "You read the wind by watching how the grass bends. You estimate the range by counting fence posts because each section of stone wall on this farm is roughly 40 yards long. You control your breathing, letting half the air out of your lungs so your chest is still. You place the crosshair not where the target is, but where it will be when the bullet arrives. And then you squeeze the trigger without flinching, without jerking, without anticipating the recoil. The bullet is just the final step. Everything that decides whether it hits or misses has already happened before your finger moves." Daniel listened. He did not fully understand, but he heard. And the next evening, he went back to the hill, set up in the same spot, spotted a woodchuck at 180 yards, watched the grass, counted the fence posts, controlled his breathing, and fired. The woodchuck dropped. 25 cents. Daniel Keller practiced every evening after milking. Spring, summer, fall, through his 15th year, his 16th, his 17th. The pasture was his classroom. The woodchucks were his curriculum, and the data accumulated in his notebook. The way the seasons accumulated on the farm, steady, patient, unrelenting. At 16, he could hit a woodchuck consistently at 200 yards. At 18, 300. He developed instincts that no manual could teach. He learned to sense the moment between heartbeats when his body was most still, to squeeze the trigger so smoothly that the shot surprised him, which meant he had not flinched. In 1936, when Daniel was 20, he took the money he had saved from years of selling woodchuck pelts and bought himself a Winchester Model 70, chambered in .220 Swift. It was a flat-shooting cartridge designed for varmint hunting with minimal bullet drop at long range. The rifle cost him nearly 4 months of savings. It changed everything. With the Winchester, Daniel pushed past 400 yards, then 450, then 500. The woodchucks at the far edge of the south pasture, the ones that had always been safe, were no longer safe. Daniel learned to calculate bullet drop at extreme distance to adjust for crosswinds that shifted between him and the target to lead a running woodchuck the way a wing shooter leads a crossing bird. One shot, one kill, at distances that would have seemed absurd to anyone who had not spent 6 years building toward them. By 1941, Daniel Keller had killed more than 600 woodchucks. His notebook held over a decade of data. Average engagement range 380 yards. Longest confirmed shot 547 yards. A target smaller than a man's fist at 547 yards. With a hunting rifle and iron discipline learned on a hillside in Lancaster County. But nobody knew. Outside of Harold, not a single person on earth understood what Daniel could do with a rifle. In the town of Lancaster, he was just the Keller boy who milked cows. His skill existed in the space between a father, a son, a notebook, and several thousand dead woodchucks. It was a secret kept not by intention, but by indifference. Who would care that a farm boy could shoot rodents at long range? Who would ever need to know? The answer to that question arrived on a Sunday morning. December 7th, 1941, through a radio in a cow barn. Harold and Daniel heard the news together, standing in the milking parlor with their hands wet and their boots muddy. Pearl Harbor. Daniel was 25. He did not enlist immediately. Harold needed him on the farm. There were cows to milk, fences to mend, and woodchucks to kill. The war was far away. But by 1943, the draft had widened, and Daniel's number came up. He could have sought a deferment. Farmers were eligible. Harold would have supported it. But Daniel did not ask. Something in him, the same quiet stubbornness that had kept him on that hillside for 13 years shooting at targets most men could not even see, told him it was time to go. The morning Daniel left for Fort Meade, Harold stood at the gate of the farm. He did not embrace his son. Pennsylvania Dutch men of that generation did not do such things. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Daniel's woodchuck notebook, the one with 13 years of entries, and handed it to him. "Take this, so you remember how to shoot." That was all. No speech, no tears, no long goodbye. Daniel took the notebook, put it in his shirt pocket, climbed onto the bus, and rode south toward Maryland. He did not look back. Harold stood at the gate until the bus disappeared around the bend in the road, then turned and walked back to the barn. There were cows to milk. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to know something about the state of American military sniping in 1943. It was, to put it plainly, almost non-existent. The Soviet Union had entered the war with roughly 60,000 trained snipers. The Germans had established dedicated sniper schools and produced marksmen like Matthias Hetzenauer, who would finish the war with 345 confirmed kills. But the United States Army in 1943 had no formal standardized sniper training program. The military establishment regarded sniping as a secondary skill, not a primary discipline. Standard infantry doctrine stated that 300 yards was the maximum effective range for aimed rifle fire. Beyond that, the official position held there were too many variables. Anything past 300 yards was considered a waste of ammunition. The only dedicated sniper rifle the Army had adopted was the Springfield M1903A4, a modified bolt-action fitted with a Weaver M73B1 scope offering just 2.75 times magnification. For comparison, the Marine Corps used the Unertl scope at 8 times magnification, and the Germans commonly employed 4 times or higher. The Army's sniper with his modest optic was expected to operate within 300 yards. That was doctrine. That was the limit. Daniel Keller arrived at Fort Meade, Maryland in the spring of 1943. The 81st Infantry Division, nicknamed the Blue Ridge Division, was forming up for deployment to Europe. Daniel was assigned to a rifle company and sent through basic infantry training. He was quiet, competent, unremarkable. Another farm boy in an army full of farm boys, until the rifle range. At 200 yards, Daniel scored perfect. Every round in the center of the target. At 300 yards, near perfect. Tight grouping all within the scoring rings. The range instructor, a broad-shouldered sergeant named Frank Novak from Pittsburgh, noticed. Novak was a steelworker's son, third-generation Bethlehem steel, with hands scarred from hot metal and a disposition that trusted only what he could see with his own eyes. He had trained hundreds of recruits. He could spot a natural shooter. Novak walked over and asked Daniel if he had fired a rifle before enlisting. Daniel said yes. He had been shooting woodchucks for 13 years. Novak asked at what range. Daniel said 300 to 500 yards mostly. Novak laughed. Not a mean laugh, but the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside his experience that he cannot process it as truth. He laughed in front of the entire platoon. 500 yards with what a cannon. Daniel did not argue. He did not know how to argue. He had spent 13 years on a hillside where the only audience was his father, and the only scoreboard was a notebook. He had never needed to convince anyone of anything. The woodchucks did not require persuasion. They simply dropped or they did not. Daniel asked if he could demonstrate. Novak looked at the range officer, who shrugged. They set up a man-sized silhouette target at 500 yards. The distance was so far that from the firing line the target was barely visible to the naked eye. A few soldiers gathered to watch. Most expected entertainment. Daniel lay down in the prone position. He picked up the M1903A4 he had been issued with its Weaver scope. Through that scope at 500 yards, the target was small, smaller than a woodchuck at 300, but visible. Daniel did what he had done 10,000 times on the south pasture. He read the wind, estimated the range, controlled his breathing, and squeezed. The spotter called the hit. Center mass. The range officer asked Daniel to fire again. Daniel worked the bolt, chambered another round, and fired. Hit, again, hit. 3 rounds, 3 hits, grouping within 4 inches at 500 yards. With a rifle he had been issued that morning. The range went quiet. Not the quiet of indifference. The quiet of men recalculating what they thought they knew. The range officer made a note in his report. Daniel was flagged for sniper training and transferred to a specialized course. At the sniper school, the instructors taught 300 yards as maximum effective range. Daniel asked why they did not train beyond that distance. The instructor gave the standard answer. Too many variables. Daniel said he had been hitting targets the size of a man's fist at 500 yards for years. The instructor looked at him the way Novak had looked at him. A woodchuck doesn't shoot back, the instructor said. It was a fair point, and Daniel had no answer for it, not yet. Daniel was assigned back to the 81st Infantry Division with his M1903A4 and his Weaver scope. Sergeant Novak, who had been tracking Daniel's progress with skeptical interest, took to calling him the Woodchuck Kid. Half mocking, half curious. Novak respected skill, but only skill he had personally witnessed under pressure. A training range was not pressure. Until he saw Daniel perform under fire, the Woodchuck Kid was just a farm boy with a good eye and an unlikely story. The 81st Infantry Division shipped to France in August of 1944, part of 12th Corps under Major General Manton Eddy, assigned to General George Patton's Third Army. They landed at Utah Beach weeks after D-Day and pushed inland through the bocage country of Normandy. And it was there, in the dense hedgerows and sunken lanes of northwestern France, that Daniel Keller became invisible. The bocage was a nightmare for a long-range shooter. Every field was small, bordered by ancient hedgerows 10 feet thick with visibility rarely exceeding 50 yards. Firefights erupted at close range, 30 yards, 40 yards, sometimes close enough to hear the enemy breathing. There were no long sightlines, no open pastures. Daniel fought like every other rifleman in the company, crouching behind hedgerows, firing through gaps in the brush, advancing field by field through a landscape that denied exactly the kind of shooting he was trained for. Novak watched Daniel through the bocage weeks. Keller was calm under fire, competent, reliable, but unremarkable. Just another rifleman banging away at short range. And Novak began to think that maybe the training range magic only worked on a Pennsylvania hillside with all the time in the world and no one shooting back. But the bocage was not forever, and the terrain of France was about to change. By late August 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered the German defensive lines. Patton's Third Army raced east across France. The 81st Division pushed through the liberated countryside toward the Moselle River and the province of Lorraine. And as the miles passed, the landscape shifted. The hedgerows thinned, the fields widened, the sunken lanes gave way to open farm roads. And suddenly, Daniel Keller was looking at country he recognized. Lorraine in September was rolling agricultural land, wide valleys between gentle ridges, harvested grain fields with low stubble, scattered stone walls dividing the pastures, long unobstructed sightlines stretching 400, 500, 600 yards across open ground. Daniel stood on a ridge east of the Moselle River, looking out over a valley of recently harvested farmland, and felt his heart accelerate for the first time since he had set foot in France. The hills rolled the same way. The stone walls sat at the same intervals. The wind moved through the stubble grass with the same patterns he had read 10,000 times on the South pasture in Lancaster County. This was Pennsylvania, not literally, but in every way that mattered to a man who had spent 13 years learning to kill at distance by reading terrain. This was home. Daniel reached into his shirt pocket and touched the woodchuck notebook. And for the first time since Normandy, he felt the weight of what he carried. Novak noticed the change. He could not have explained it in words, but he saw it. From the moment the division entered Lorraine, Daniel Keller moved differently. His eyes swept the terrain differently. He chose positions differently. In Normandy, Keller had crouched and advanced like every other rifleman. In Lorraine, he moved like a hunter, seeking high ground, evaluating sightlines, reading the wind before anyone asked him to. The first days of September 1944 brought the 81st Division to the banks of the Moselle River. Their mission was to cross the river north of the city of Nancy, establish a bridgehead, and allow the 4th Armored Division to sweep through and encircle the German defenders. Opposing them were elements of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, a veteran unit that had fought on the Eastern Front since 1942, and the 92nd Luftwaffe Field Regiment, an outfit of Luftwaffe ground personnel, converted to infantry with limited combat experience. The crossing at Dieulouard on September 12th was hard fought. German counterattacks nearly pushed the Americans back into the river, but the 81st held, and by September 13th, the bridgehead was secure. Daniel's company dug in on a ridge east of the river. Below them lay a valley of open farmland roughly 800 yards across, recently harvested, low stubble, stone walls scattered across the floor. A ruined farm complex sat in the center of the valley, about 380 yards from each ridge. On the far side, the opposite ridge was held by German forces. On the night of September 13th, Lieutenant James Hadley received a report from the company's forward scouts. Approximately 80 German soldiers had been observed concentrating on the opposite ridge. Luftwaffe infantry, not professional ground troops. If those 80 Germans crossed the valley and occupied the farm complex, they would have a direct firing position on the American ridge. Dislodging them from stone buildings would require a full-scale assault or heavy artillery, neither of which was immediately available. Artillery coordination would take 20 to 30 minutes. Hadley needed a way to stop 80 men crossing open ground. His machine guns could harass at that distance, but not stop them. He needed precision. And precision at 400 yards was, according to everything the army had taught him, impossible with a rifle. That night, Daniel cleaned his Springfield and checked every component of the Weaver scope. He opened the woodchuck notebook. The last entry was from March 1943. A woodchuck at 410 yards south, pasture light wind, kill. Tomorrow the targets would be different, but the craft would be the same. Everything that matters happens before. Daniel closed the notebook and waited for morning. The morning of September 14th, 1944 broke clear and cool over the Lorraine countryside. A thin mist clung to the valley floor, at dawn pooling in the low spots between stone walls curling around the ruined farm buildings. By noon, the valley lay fully exposed under a pale September sky. Daniel had been watching since first light. He lay behind a chest-high stone wall on the American Ridge, his Springfield resting on a folded blanket draped over the top stones. Through the scope, the valley resolved into a patchwork of brown stubble, gray stone, and pale green grass growing along the wall lines. He could see individual stones in the farm buildings at 380 yards. He could see the fence posts on the far ridge at 700. And then something struck him. The stone walls in this valley were spaced roughly 40 yards apart, the same spacing as the walls on Harold's farm, the walls his father had used to teach him range estimation when he was 14 years old. Count the walls. Each section is about 40 yards. Here in a valley in eastern France, some farmer a century ago had stacked stones at almost exactly the same intervals as the Keller family had stacked theirs in Lancaster County. If Daniel closed his eyes and listened only to the breeze moving through the stubble, he could have been lying on the hill above the south pasture, waiting for a woodchuck to emerge near the far fence line. He opened his eyes. He was not in Pennsylvania. The targets coming across this valley would be carrying rifles. If you or anyone in your family served in the 81st Infantry Division or fought in the Lorraine Campaign in the fall of 1944, tell us about it in the comments below. We want to hear your story. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Hadley stiffened behind his binoculars. Movement on the far ridge. Infantry. Looks like a full company. Daniel shifted his scope. Figures emerging from the woods. Olive gray uniforms. Helmets. Rifles slung over shoulders. They moved in a loose, staggered formation, not bunched, but not spread thin either. The formation of men who expected no opposition at this range. Daniel counted as they appeared: 20, 40, 60, 80. 80 German soldiers walking into the valley. They were from the 92nd Luftwaffe Field Regiment. Mechanics, armorers, radar technicians, ground crew for fighter squadrons that no longer existed. Reorganized into infantry and sent to hold the line in Lorraine because the Wehrmacht had run out of trained soldiers. They had received basic weapons training. They could march and fire a carabiner 98K at close range, but they were not professional ground soldiers. And the man who had sent them across this valley had assured them they would be safe at this distance. That man was Hauptmann Werner Brandt of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division. Brandt was a career officer who had fought on the Eastern Front since 1942 through Kharkov-Kursk, the long retreat across Ukraine, and the transfer to France. He had survived 3 years of the most brutal ground combat in human history. He had faced Soviet snipers at Stalingrad. He was, by any measure, one of the most experienced combat officers left in the German army. And he was absolutely certain the Americans could not hit his men at 400 yards. Brandt calculated the risk the way any experienced infantry officer would. The Americans were dug in on their ridge 400 to 600 yards from the center of the valley. At that range, aimed rifle fire was ineffective. Machine guns could suppress but not target individuals. The real danger was artillery, but that would take 20 to 30 minutes. 20 minutes was more than enough for 80 men to cross 400 yards and occupy stone buildings. The math was simple. The distance was safe. Every army in the world agreed. Brandt gave the order. His men walked upright, rifles slung, no zigzagging, no rushing, because there was no need. They were beyond range. On the American ridge, Hadley reached the same conclusion from the other side. Too far. Rifle fire would not stop them. Artillery was not available. In 20 minutes, 80 Germans would be inside stone buildings 380 yards from the American line. Hadley turned to Daniel. The corporal was already in position, scope up, watching the lead element of the German formation. "Keller, what's the range to the lead man?" 480 yards, sir. 12 stone wall sections. "Can you hit him?" Daniel was watching the grass in the valley. The breeze was still steady left to right. The German was walking at a normal pace, upright rifle on his shoulder. A man's torso is 18 inches across, far larger than anything Daniel had ever aimed at on the south pasture. 3 times the target at the same range. "Yes, sir." Hadley looked at Novak. Novak met his eyes. Something in his expression had changed from the training days at Fort Meade. He had watched Daniel on the Lorraine ridges for 2 weeks, had seen the way the man read terrain, the way a master tradesman reads raw material. "Here's your call, Lieutenant," Novak said. "Try it, Keller." Daniel settled into his position. Crosshair on the chest of the lead German. 480 yards. Wind left to right. At that range, the bullet would take just over half a second to arrive. The wind would push it roughly 2 feet. Daniel adjusted, held left, raised the crosshair to compensate for a drop. And in the fraction of a second before he squeezed the trigger, he heard his father's voice. Not a memory. Something deeper. The shot is already made before you pull the trigger. He had read the wind, calculated the range, controlled his breathing, placed the crosshair where the bullet and the target would meet. Everything that mattered had already happened. Daniel squeezed. The lead German dropped. He fell forward mid-stride as if the ground had opened beneath him. His helmet bounced and rolled into the stubble. The men behind him kept walking. At 480 yards, the sound of the shot took nearly a second and a half to reach them, mixed with the breeze indistinguishable from a distant branch snapping. They did not hear it as a gunshot. One man had fallen. Perhaps he stumbled. They walked on. Daniel worked the bolt, chambered a fresh round, found the next German. 460 yards, same wind, squeezed. The second German dropped. Now the others noticed. 2 men down in 15 seconds. The soldiers nearest the fallen men stopped and looked around. Confusion, not panic, not yet. 2 men collapsing could mean many things. The human mind resists the conclusion that someone is killing from a distance the mind considers safe. Daniel fired again. 440 yards. The third German fell. Now they knew someone was shooting. The Germans started running forward toward the nearest cover, a stone wall roughly 100 yards ahead. Daniel fired 4 times in 30 seconds. His bolt worked smoothly, the action so practiced that the movement was nearly automatic. 4 Germans dropped in the open ground. The remaining soldiers reached the wall. 66 men alive, crouching behind stacked stones 420 yards from Daniel Keller. Still too far for their carabiner 98K rifles. Some of them fired anyway. The rounds fell short, kicking up dirt 100 yards in front of the American ridge. Useless. They were pinned. 66 men trapped by a single shooter at a range that was not supposed to be dangerous. Behind that wall, the Luftwaffe soldiers were in a state approaching panic. 7 of their comrades had dropped in the open ground within minutes. No one had seen a muzzle flash. No one had clearly heard a shot. At this distance, the Americans were supposed to be harmless. That is what they had been told. That is what every doctrine, every training lesson, every reassurance from their officers had promised. And 7 bodies lay in the stubble as evidence that the promise was a lie. Hadley watched through his binoculars. 7 bodies in the open ground, all at ranges over 400 yards. He lowered the binoculars and looked at Daniel. The corporal was still in position, cheek against the stock eye, to the scope motionless. His breathing was even. His hands were steady. He looked exactly like a man lying on a hillside waiting for a woodchuck to emerge from its burrow. "How are you doing this, Keller?" Daniel did not take his eye from the scope. Same as woodchucks, sir. After 13 years, it becomes instinct. The Germans behind the wall did what soldiers always do when pinned by fire they cannot see. They waited. Minutes passed. The shooting had stopped. Perhaps it was safe to look. After 2 minutes, a German soldier raised his head above the wall. Just his head. Just for a second. Daniel had been watching through his scope. At 420 yards, the Weaver optic showed the top of the stone wall in sharp detail. Every gap, every shadow. When the helmet appeared, Daniel was already aligned. He fired. The soldier's head snapped backward. 3 minutes later, another man peeked over the stones. Daniel fired. 9 down. 71 men pinned behind a stone wall by one rifleman. Novak stood 10 yards from Daniel, watching the valley. He had stopped talking. He was watching something he had never seen before and would never see again. At Bethlehem Steel, the best pourers could judge the temperature of molten metal by the color of its glow, could feel the moment a pour was ready by the vibration in the ladle handle. No instrument matched their accuracy. No training manual could replicate their instinct. They had simply done the same thing so many thousands of times that the knowledge had migrated from their minds into their hands. It was no longer thinking. It was being. That was what Novak was watching. Daniel Keller was not aiming a rifle. He was being a shooter the way a master steelworker is a pourer. 13 years of woodchucks had done what no military training program could accomplish in any number of weeks. They had made the art of long-range killing as natural as breathing. 15 minutes passed. The Germans grew desperate. They could not stay. Artillery would come eventually. They could not retreat across open ground. Their only option was forward. The farm buildings were 200 yards ahead. 20 seconds of running. If enough men ran at once, the shooter could not get them all. 20 Germans broke from behind the wall and sprinted for the farm complex. Daniel tracked them through his scope. Running men at 380 yards. He fired 6 times. 5 dropped. 15 made it to the buildings. Now the Germans were split. 15 in the farm buildings. 56 behind the wall. Both groups pinned by one man. At 3:15, 10 men from behind the wall turned and ran the opposite direction, back toward their own ridge, retreating. The range was increasing with every stride. 420 yards, 450, 480, running targets at growing distance. This was the hardest shot there is. Daniel thought of Harold standing behind him on the hillside when he was 16, saying quietly, "Lead it. The bullet and the target meet at the same point." Daniel led the rearmost runner. 490 yards, now moving fast. Fired. The German fell crumpling mid-stride. Daniel worked the bolt. Next runner. 510 yards. Lead adjusted. Fired. Down. The remaining 8 made it to the far ridge and disappeared into the trees. Across the valley, Hauptmann Werner Brandt received the reports, and for the first time in 3 years of war, the first time since Kharkov and Kursk and the long bleeding retreat across half of Europe, Werner Brandt confronted something that did not fit inside his understanding of combat. 16 dead, an entire company pinned or shattered. No machine gun fire, no mortars, no artillery, one rifleman at 400 to 500 yards. Brandt asked the question 3 times because the answer made no sense. One shooter, bolt-action rifle, hitting running targets beyond 400 meters with a consistency that defied every engagement table he had ever studied. Brandt stared at the valley, at the bodies scattered across the stubble, at his men cowering behind a wall that should have been a stepping stone and had become a prison. He said it quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Das ist unmöglich bei dieser Entfernung." That is impossible at this distance. But the bodies did not care about possibility. They lay in the stubble at ranges that no doctrine, no training manual, no 3 years of Eastern Front experience said were lethal. At 3:45, Hadley received word that artillery support was available. He called in coordinates. The first shells landed on the farm buildings and the stone wall 20 minutes later. The explosion shattered what was left of the German formation, and the Germans broke. All of them, the men behind the wall and the men in the buildings. They abandoned their positions and ran for the far ridge, a disorganized flood of men desperate to reach the tree line. Daniel watched them through his scope, targets at increasing range. He fired 11 times. 8 fell. At 440, at 460, at 500, at 540, and the last one at 582 yards, the longest shot of the day. A German soldier running at nearly full speed 582 yards from the muzzle of Daniel Keller's Springfield. Through the scope, the man was barely a shape, a gray smudge against brown stubble. Daniel led him by 4 feet. Calculated the flight time nearly 9/10 of a second. Calculated the wind drift across 582 yards of open ground. Held his breath and squeezed 9/10 of a second. The bullet crossed the valley. The wind pushed it. Gravity pulled it. And at 582 yards, the bullet and the running man arrived at the same point in space at the same instant in time. The German fell mid-stride. His momentum carried him forward and he tumbled into the stubble and lay still. By 4 o'clock, the valley was quiet. 34 soldiers lay dead in the harvested fields, all killed by Daniel Keller, all at ranges between 380 and 582 yards. The remaining 46 Germans had retreated to their ridge and showed no sign of moving again. Novak walked over to where Daniel lay behind the wall. The corporal had not moved from his firing position. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 hours ago, as if nothing had happened, as if he had spent the afternoon on a hillside in Pennsylvania, doing what he had always done. Novak sat down next to him. The silence between them was different now than it had been in training. It was the silence of a man who has seen something that has permanently rearranged his understanding of what is possible. I owe you a hell of an apology, Keller. Daniel looked at his own hands. They were calm, not a tremor. The same hands that had milked cows at dawn squeezed the trigger 34 times that afternoon, killed 600 woodchucks over 13 years. Steady, professional, unchanged. And that more than anything was what frightened him. Not the killing, not the distance. What frightened Daniel Keller was how easy it had been, not technically. The shots demanded every ounce of 13 years of practice encoded in his muscles, but emotionally. He had killed 34 human beings with the same clinical calm he felt when a woodchuck dropped at 400 yards on the south pasture. The process was identical. The feeling was identical. And the fact that it was identical told Daniel something about himself that he had not known before and would spend the rest of his life trying not to think about. That night, Hadley wrote his report by the light of a shielded candle. Enemy infantry advance stopped by single rifleman firing at extreme range. Corporal Keller 34 confirmed kills, ranges 380 to 582 yards. Recommend formal review of engagement and evaluation of Corporal Keller's marksmanship methods. The report traveled up the chain of command to the headquarters of the 81st Infantry Division. The officers who read it did not believe it. 34 kills at those ranges by one man with a low-power scope. The numbers contradicted everything the Army taught about effective rifle range. Either the report was exaggerated, or something had happened in that valley that doctrine could not explain. They decided to find out which one it was. The officer from division headquarters arrived 3 days after the valley engagement. He was a major clean-shaven, with the careful posture of a man who had spent most of the war behind a desk and knew it. He carried a clipboard and a skepticism that was evident in every question he asked before he even laid eyes on Daniel Keller. He had read Hadley's report twice. He had circled the number 582 and written a question mark next to it. Marine Corps snipers with their 8-power Unertl scopes had made kills at similar ranges in the Pacific, but those Marines had 3 times the magnification. A corporal in an infantry division with a Weaver scope designed for 300-yard work claiming consistent kills past 500 yards was a different category of claim entirely. The major asked Hadley to describe the engagement. Hadley did. The major asked if other soldiers had been firing. Only Keller. The major asked if artillery hits could have inflated the count. Hadley noted that artillery did not arrive until after the majority of kills occurred. The major asked to see Corporal Keller. Daniel was sitting on an ammunition crate cleaning his Springfield with an oiled rag. He stood when the major approached. Average height, lean, quiet eyes. Nothing about his appearance suggested the extraordinary. He looked like what he was, a dairy farmer in a uniform. The major asked Daniel to explain how he had made the shots. Daniel cooperated the way he did everything. Simply, he told the major about the stone walls in the valley, how they were spaced at the same intervals as the walls on his father's farm, how he had used them to estimate range the same way he had since he was 14. He told him about reading wind by watching the grass, about the way stubble bends differently than clover, but the principle is the same. He told him about the woodchucks, not the technique of shooting them, which the major could have found in any marksmanship manual, but the experience of shooting them 10,000 times over 13 years, until every step of the process disappeared into the unconscious. Until calculating wind drift and bullet drop required no more conscious thought than walking requires conscious attention to the placement of each foot. The major wanted a demonstration. They set up man-sized targets at 400 and 500 yards. Daniel lay prone, settled the Springfield on a rest and fired. First round at 400. Center mass. Confirmed. First round at 500. Center mass. Confirmed. 3 more rounds at 500. 3 hits. Grouping within 5 inches, with standard ammunition. The major lowered his binoculars. The clipboard hung at his side. Novak, watching from 30 yards away, recognized what he was seeing on the major's face. It was the same expression Novak himself had worn on the rifle range at Fort Meade, and again behind the stone wall in the valley. The expression of a man whose map of the world has just been proven incomplete. The major wrote his evaluation that evening. Corporal Keller possesses exceptional long-range marksmanship ability derived from extensive civilian varmint hunting experience. His methods of range estimation, wind reading, and trigger control are self-taught but highly effective and consistent. Recommend formal study of Corporal Keller's techniques for potential incorporation into Army sniper training programs. Through the fall of 1944, Daniel Keller served as the primary sniper for his company across the Lorraine campaign. The terrain remained favorable. Rolling farmland, open valleys, long sightlines. He engaged German soldiers at ranges that increased steadily as his confidence with the M1903A4 grew. 400 yards became routine. 500 was common. By October, he was connecting at 550. In November, 600. His longest confirmed engagement came on a cold morning in late November. A German officer standing in a communication trench at 650 yards. 1 round, 1 kill. By December, Daniel Keller's total confirmed kills had reached 89. His average engagement range was 430 yards. Every single kill exceeded the 300-yard limit the Army had established as the ceiling of aimed rifle fire. Every single kill was made with the modest Weaver optic that offered less magnification than most hunting scopes available at a hardware store. During the war, the average American infantryman expended approximately 25,000 rounds for every enemy combatant killed. Daniel Keller's ratio was fewer than 2 rounds per confirmed kill. The gap between those numbers is the gap between doctrine and mastery, between what the training manual said was possible and what 13 years on a hillside had actually produced. But there is a moment in every story about killing, at distance, that the numbers cannot capture. A moment when the craft separates from the man who practices it, and the man is left alone with what the craft has done. For Daniel, that moment came on a grey afternoon in late November, weeks before his final confirmed kill. He was in a forward position, prone behind a low-ridge scope trained on a stretch of German trench line 520 yards away. The weather was cold, frost on the stubble, breath visible in the still air. A German officer emerged from a dugout. He stood at the edge of the trench, half sheltered by sandbags, and lit a cigarette. Through the scope, Daniel could see the small flare of the match, the first curl of smoke in the cold air. The officer cupped his hands around the cigarette, then turned to someone inside the dugout and said something that made him laugh. Not a forced laugh, a real one. His shoulders shook, his head tilted back. For a moment in the grey light of November in France, he was just a man sharing a joke with a friend. Daniel watched him. The crosshair rested on the officer's chest. The range was calculated. The wind was red. Everything that mattered had already happened. But Daniel did not fire immediately. He watched the officer laugh. And something shifted behind his eyes that had not shifted during the Valley engagement, not during the 34 kills on September 14th, not during any of the dozens of kills that followed. For the first time, Daniel saw a person at the other end of his scope. Not a target, a man, standing in the cold, smoking a cigarette, laughing. Daniel thought of Harold. His father had the same habit. Standing outside the cow barn on cold mornings, cigarette between calloused fingers, chuckling at something only he found funny. The same posture, the same tilt of the head. 10 seconds passed. The officer turned back toward the trench, took another drag. Daniel fired. The officer collapsed. The cigarette fell from his hand and landed in the frost beside the sandbags, a tiny ember glowing against the white ground for a few seconds before it went dark. Daniel did not record the kill immediately. He lay still for a full minute, staring at the place where the officer had stood. The sandbags, the frost, the empty space where 10 seconds ago a man had been laughing. That night, Daniel opened the woodchuck notebook Harold had given him. He turned past the entries from 1935, 1936, 1937, found a blank space between two woodchuck entries from the spring of 1941, and wrote the German officer's data in that space. Date: range 520 yards, wind calm, result kill, same format. 3 entries in a row, 2 woodchucks and a man, indistinguishable except for the dates. And Daniel understood something that had been true since the first shot in the valley, but that he had not allowed himself to see. There was no difference in the technique. His hands did not know what stood at the other end of the scope. His instincts did not know. The craft was the craft. It did not ask. After the war, the United States Army studied Daniel Keller's engagements in detail. Researchers interviewed him extensively. Daniel told them what he told everyone. Woodchucks taught him everything. He had practiced thousands of times on Pennsylvania farmland. The Germans were simply bigger targets at longer range. The Army incorporated his methods into revised sniper training doctrine. They raised the standard for maximum engagement range from 300 to 500 yards. They emphasized that civilian varmint hunting provided ideal preparation for military sniping. Small targets, extreme distances, single-shot opportunities. The skills transferred to combat with almost no modification. A farm boy with a .22 caliber rifle and a 25-cent bounty had over 13 years independently developed shooting techniques that the most sophisticated military training programs in the world had failed to produce. The Army's response was not to celebrate Daniel Keller. It was to study him, extract his methods, codify them into manuals, and distribute them to sniper schools across the service. Daniel became a data point, a case study, an anonymous proof of concept that would shape American sniping for decades. Daniel Keller returned to Lancaster County in the spring of 1946. He drove up the dirt road to the farm in a borrowed truck. Harold was standing at the gate, older, his back more curved, his hands thinner, but standing, waiting. Harold did not ask about the war. Daniel did not offer. They walked to the barn together. and Harold showed Daniel what needed fixing. A section of fence along the north pasture, a leak in the milking parlor roof, the woodchuck problem in the south pasture, which had gotten worse in Daniel's absence. Daniel picked up his Springfield that evening, the same M1903A4 he had carried through France. He cleaned it, checked the scope, and walked up the hill to the south pasture. Set up in the same spot he had used since he was 14, watched the grass, waited. A woodchuck appeared near the far wall. 390 yards. Light wind. Daniel fired. It dropped. He opened a new notebook. Wrote the date, the range, the wind, the result. Same format as every notebook before it. And the skill that had killed 89 men in the valleys of eastern France went back to its original purpose, keeping cows from breaking their legs in woodchuck holes. People in town asked about the war. Daniel said he was infantry. They nodded. Changed the subject. The way people did in 1946 when every other man in Lancaster County had served somewhere and nobody wanted to relive it over coffee. Daniel never corrected them. He never mentioned the valley. One afternoon, not long after Daniel's return, Harold climbed the hill and sat down next to his son in the grass, the way he had done in 1940, the last time before the war. Daniel was glassing the pasture through the weaver scope, watching for movement. Harold said nothing for a long time. Then Daniel fired. A woodchuck at 450 yards. It dropped. Harold nodded. The same nod, the same silence, the same approval expressed through the absence of words. But Daniel understood it differently now. Harold's silence was not emptiness, it was completeness. Harold had taught his son everything that mattered before Daniel ever pulled a trigger. Range, wind, breathing, patience. The quiet discipline of doing one thing over and over until the doing of it disappears into the being of it. Harold had given Daniel a sentence that contained an entire philosophy in 11 words, and Daniel had carried that sentence across an ocean and used it to kill 89 men, and then carried it back and used it to kill woodchucks again. Harold did not need to ask about the war. He already knew everything that mattered. He had taught it. In 1957, a military historian researching the evolution of American sniper tactics tracked Daniel Keller through Army records. He drove to Lancaster County and found Daniel on the farm, 41 years old, weathered quiet, still milking cows and shooting woodchucks on the same 200 acres where he had been born. The historian wanted to know about September 14th. Daniel said there was not much to tell. He saw Germans at Woodchuck Range. He shot them. The historian asked about the 582-yard shot on a running target. Daniel explained it as if explaining how to change a tire. You lead them by the right amount. You do not shoot where they are. You shoot where they will be. The historian asked whether his years of woodchuck hunting had been good preparation for combat. Daniel considered the question the way he considered wind and range, carefully, from multiple angles. Yes and no. Yes, because the shooting was identical. No, because woodchucks do not shoot back. But the fundamentals were the same. You hit a target the size of your fist at 500 yards enough times, and hitting a man at that range becomes routine. The historian wrote it down. Daniel did not elaborate. He did not mention the German officer with the cigarette. He did not mention the 2 notebooks. There are things that belong in notebooks and things that do not. At a reunion of the 81st Infantry Division, one of the rare occasions Daniel attended, an old soldier asked him which shot in the war had been the hardest. Everyone at the table expected the answer. The 582-yard running shot, one of the impossible long-range kills that had become legend within the division. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The first one, 480 yards, not because of the distance, because after that first one I knew everything I had learned killing woodchucks would work on men, and I was not sure I wanted to know that." Novak, who was at the same table, said later that it was the only time he ever heard Daniel speak about the war with anything resembling emotion. After he said it, Daniel stood up, put on his hat, and drove back to the farm. Daniel Keller died in May of 1998. He was 82 years old. A heart attack on the farm on the hillside above the south pasture. The same hill where he had fired his first shot at a woodchuck in 1930 and his last shot at a woodchuck 3 days before he died. His obituary in the Lancaster newspaper listed his military service in a single line served in the United States Army during World War II as infantry. It did not mention the 89 confirmed kills. It did not mention the valley. It did not mention that on a single September afternoon in 1944, one man with a bolt-action rifle had stopped an enemy advance that 80 soldiers could not complete. His children found the 2 notebooks on his nightstand when they cleared the house. The first notebook, Woodchucks, more than 2,000 entries beginning in 1930 and ending 3 days before his death. The final entry read, May 11th, 1998. Range 380 yards. Wind left to right light. Result kill. The handwriting was tremulous but legible. The format had not changed in 68 years. The second notebook, 89 entries. September to December 1944. Same format. Date range wind result. No names, no reflections, just data. Identical in every way to the first notebook except for what the entries recorded. The Springfield M1903A4 that Daniel carried through the war is now in a private collection. The Weaver M73B1 scope is still mounted. The stock bears 89 small notches, each one carved with the tip of a knife, each one representing a confirmed kill at a range exceeding 300 yards. Daniel Keller proved those shots were not impossible. He proved it 34 times in a single afternoon and 89 times across 4 months of war. He proved it with a scope that offered less magnification than most hunting optics on a hardware store shelf. He proved it with techniques learned not from the military, but from a dairy farmer in Lancaster County who taught his son to read wind by watching grass and estimate distance by counting stone walls. The shot is already made before you pull the trigger. Everything that matters happens before. Harold Keller said that to a frustrated 14-year-old boy on a hillside in 1930. That boy heard it, practiced it, lived it for 13 years on a farm where no one watched and no one cared. Carried it across an ocean to a valley in France that looked exactly like the pasture where he learned it. Used it to kill 89 men, carried it home. And used it to kill woodchucks for another 52 years on the same hill, in the same grass with the same wind bending the same clover, until the day he died. Same hill, same wind, same scope. Only the notebooks were different. And perhaps that is the truest thing about Daniel Keller. Not the distance of the shots, not the number of the kills, not the doctrine he changed. The truest thing is that between killing a woodchuck at 500 yards and killing a man at 500 yards, the only difference was which notebook you wrote the result in. The wind did not know the difference. The bullet did not know the difference. The trigger did not know the difference. Only the man knew, and he never spoke of it. If this story has moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Share this with someone who understands that the quietest skills, the ones learned in solitude on hillsides, no one visits in crafts, no one celebrates, are sometimes the ones that change everything. Thank you for making sure that stories like Daniel Keller's do not disappear into silence.